That is that they combine both online and in-classroom instruction. And this spring, with the outbreak of the virus, we've gone completely online with our programs for the time being, because the state of California requires us to shelter in place. So our campuses are closed, and all of our teaching is online, but we have taught every single course. We're learning to adapt in this new world. It's really changing. But today we're going to talk about also the 8 programs that we'll be enrolling for the fall. When I'm finished, admissions will come back on for a few minutes and give you a little bit more details about that. Yesterday, I was on the phone with our accreditation agency, WASC. They had a webinar for all of the schools in California. And part of what they talked about was this unprecedented time, the need for flexibility, for innovation, but with disciplined assessment, to really pay attention to what's happening, that we're all evolving and improving our virtual presences as universities throughout the entire state and through the region. What we're doing at Pacifica is attempting, I should say, to make our virtual world as beautiful as our campuses. And as we go forward, we're going to be doing more combining and bridging these different modalities of presentation. But I think what's really important is for us to take a moment to think about depth psychology and the depth perspective. That's at the heart of Pacifica's, all of our programs, and it's really about a reflective, compassionate engagement with one another in the world, soul in and of the world. It's part of our motto. And that means the inclusion of the other, otherness. It first started with the notion of the unconscious, but it's more broadly been expanded to the whole notion of alterity, to the sense of the experience of others, those who have been excluded in one form or another. And of course, during this pandemic, we're seeing that. You know, the statistics on people of color are really suffering at a disproportionately higher level than their white counterparts. And that much of this is economic and class. We're all suffering, but it is disproportionate. And that is important from a depth perspective to tune into those places where what is ignored, what is not being taken care of, is given a broader, deeper set of reflections. We want to be thinking and feeling and imagining. Even our spirituality needs to be responsive to the times. And that leads me to a kind of deeper archetypal layer to what's going on right now. We're in a time of the apocalyptic imagination. Now, that's something that has stirred up throughout history. Almost every generation has had some experiences of apocalypse, but there are particular moments that history is punctuated by when there are genuine threats to ourselves as a world and as a species, and we're in one of those moments. Biblical flood is one example, millenarian movements, even in the sci-fi and horror film genres, zombies and so forth, they're post-apocalyptic fantasies. And so how do we relate to these fantasies that we're having, all of us? There's no avoiding this because they are collective and they're mythic. They come from an archetypal layer of the unconscious. We have to take that very seriously, but we don't have to take it literally. We have been through pandemics before. Some of them have been fairly devastating, but always we've recovered. And so we have to use our relationship to ourselves, to our imaginations, to understand more deeply what's being called for. These are times of change. Whenever the apocalyptic imagination is activated, it's a time of transition and transformation. The things are going to be changing. And you find it in literature, in poetry, in art, these end-of-the-world fantasies. Even depth psychology, one of its originary stories is Carl Jung and his Red Book. It was just before World War I, and he had these apocalyptic imaginations of Europe filling up with blood. And that impelled him into a very deep internal reflective state for about 3 or 4 months, where he really explored and plumbed the depths of his own imagination and began to open that up into finding that he was not just imagining for himself, but he was part of a larger cultural and even global imagination that he ultimately called the archetypal. And it was filled with things like dangers of prophecy and madness, darkness, destruction, and danger, but also a time of great innovation and great creativity. And that's not just in the current moment. One of the stories, I've been looking at stories around epidemics and their consequences. And back in 1666 and 1667, the great Black Death plague in London, there have been earlier ones in the 14th century, but in the 17th century, London was particularly struck with this. And so a very young Isaac Newton fled the city and sheltered in place at a relative's farm. During that year, he conceived all of his major ideas, all of his most creative works that would be in mathematics and physics came out of that period of creative isolation. So again, times of great duress also are times of great opportunity. If you study the innovations in history, you'll see that the Second World War was one of the most innovative periods in human history for things like radar and navigation and computers and vaccines and drugs. Enormous varieties of creative responses came of this. And so that's part of our challenge. How do we begin to innovate in some new ways? And what that does, I'm talking about the activation of the heroic impulses that are buried deep in the unconscious. Some of you know the work of Joseph Campbell, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. Well, at the moment, I think that heroic image is on that of the wounded healer. The 10,000 faces of all of those doctors and nurses and first responders throughout the country and the world who are taking care of the COVID-19 infected patients and putting their own lives at risk, often without adequate PPEs and so forth. That's a wounded healer model that we're looking at. And it's part of the archetypal world that we are right in the midst of right now. It's a time of great suffering, time of great death. We've surpassed 50,000. And it may not be the end of it. You know, if you study the in quote Spanish flu from the 1918, just a little over 100 years ago, it was really the second wave of the flu that came through that was the most deadly. And we may have to be very careful about the way in which society opens and then needs to be able to close. Again, the rhythm of our engagement with this archetypal force that's present. You could say that the archetype of death is certainly present, but that also brings rebirth with it. And along with it, with those wounded healers, I want to talk for a second about compassionate care. In many traditions, whether in Buddhism, the bodhisattvas, or the saints in Christian traditions, every religious tradition has had an imagination of an ideal compassionate care person, someone who puts the welfare of others and the community ahead of their own personal well-being. And we honor and recognize the deep spirituality that resides in people who have that capacity. There's even, by the way, a Saint Corona, although she was the saint of plagues, of all things. But later she was picked up by the mafia, so she's kind of a tainted saint in some ways. So it goes. But and that's part of depth psychology. There is no light without shadow. There's no simple positive gain without some kind of darker aspect. But the activation of the innovative, the creative, and the compassionate are all part of this. We have a depth psychology with innovative healing and therapeutic practices that just has done a video. I hope it'll be up in the next day or so. It's on compassionate care. And it has several of the Asian American members of the class who are talking about countering anti-Asian racism in this era, because that's where one of the darker fantasies go, who to blame, when in fact it's our own relationship with the invisible. As we'll come to, for the ancient Greeks, the invisible was called Hades, the underworld. and the world of death. And for us, the invisible now is the world of viruses, microorganisms, but particularly viruses. And you can think of those, whether they're cyber viruses or whether they're these physical psychoid viruses living on the edge of life and non-existence, and the whole psychoid realm and the synchronistic qualities that they carry with them. So now, here we are, we're having to learn. We are learning to learn in a time of uncertainty, in a time when we don't know what's going to happen. And that's requiring, again, the flexibility and to form, paradoxically, community. Here we are, we're all alone, we're all separated, and yet, even in this event today, we're alone together. And the idea here is to form a learning community, that we will be united in our goals and our aspirations, and that community transcends our physical isolation. So, as we move through this, as we come to the end, we're in this realm of the collective unconscious now, all of us. And I think things like looking at the history of climate change is a new discipline that we can begin to locate depth psychology as part of the history of the way huge global and national changes are underway. That's part of Pacifica's mission, is to be in touch with that, to articulate it, to give it shape and image and form, and really to study it in great depth. So please stay with us for the talk by Professor Oksana Yakushko, who's going to talk to you about some clinical dimensions of all of this. But first, let me turn it back to Jessica Rubenstein and our admissions department to give you a broad overview of Pacifica's courses. Thanks so much for your listening and your attention.
Hello, everyone. Again, thank you so much for joining this event during a difficult time. We appreciate all of your time. So again, Dr. Cambray introduced me, but my name is Jessica Rubenstein. I work in admissions. I'm an admissions coordinator. And I just wanted to give you a quick overview of the admissions process. So I'm going to share my screen briefly. And I just wanted to show everyone a quick overview of the programs that we are currently enrolling. So we are currently enrolling all of the programs that you see on the screen. All of our programs have a specific focus in depth psychology, which is what makes our school unique. And if you're interested in learning more about the programs, you can contact any of our admissions advisors. I am also going to put the information in the chat box for you with the web pages where you can learn more about our admissions requirements. And it's a great idea to reach out to our admissions advisors who can tell you more about the programs and the requirements. But if you, because you attended this event today, you can apply to any of our programs for free. So on the landing page, if you view the tabs at the top, there is a tab for free application. And if you click that link, you can apply to any of our programs for free, and the program of your choice. And then after that, you should hear from an admissions advisor. So because you attended this event, you don't need to pay the $75 fee for that. So we hope everyone will apply. And then in the breakout sessions, you will also have a chance to speak individually with our faculty. So that will be a great opportunity to ask any more specific questions about the programs themselves. And then I also wanted to give a reminder that after this, after our featured speaker, which will be Dr. Oksana Yakushko, she is the chair of our clinical department, we will have a chance for you to ask her questions. So you can begin putting your questions in the chat box, and then some of your questions will be chosen to ask her after the featured presentation. Okay, so without further ado, I am going to turn it over to our featured speaker, Dr. Oksana Yakushko, who is the chair of our clinical PhD department.
We're ready. Well, hello, everyone. Warm welcome from me and appreciation for your participation in this online event. And I am going to conduct it in the way that I am conducting my classes online and also the webinars with some of the materials I've done. So I'm going to use screen share and PowerPoint slides. But before we do, I think my background is actually a beautiful campus. It is, while there's such appreciation for technology and our staff who helping us set things up, we also recognize that we have this space that is Pacifica, and it's a rather remarkable space. So I am going to first hit my screen share, and we'll go to my slides. Just a second. Slideshow and from start. So today what I want to invite us to think about is different ways that psychology is and history has been constructed and what it holds, and the choices you have and you're making in terms of becoming interested and engaged with depth psychological ideas, scholarship, and practices. And so I'm going to try to include, here's one of our beautiful campuses, going to try to include aspects of various traditions of depth psychology, scholarship, and clinical practice that we carry out at Pacifica. For myself, I want to say that I've been with Pacifica for over 10 years. For many of them, I've been honored to be the chair of the doctoral programs in clinical psychology. And in addition to this work, like most of our faculty, I practice as a clinician, but I also publish and present a lot nationally and internationally. And one of my areas of interest is history, including history of impact of witch hunts, European witch hunts on subsequent psychology, and more recently history of eugenics and social Darwinism and their continuation in psychology. And I'm going to try to present various ways of holding what Dr. Cambray referred to, some of the split off shadows and unspoken histories, and have us explore this as an invitation to consider how we could be present as clinicians, scholars, and activists in these times in which we live in. So we, of course, have noticed, you saw the programs, but I want to note them here and to make, to recognize how large is depth psychological umbrella. And even though we're very distinct educational institution offering these opportunities, there are many, many different aspects which we bring and embody here. I want to begin with a quote by, I'm going to move this, James Baldwin. Those of you familiar with his work is certainly a remarkable writer, fiction writer, and creative individual. He also was social critic. And if you're familiar with his essay collection, he writes a lot about the importance of history. And noticing in this quote that the great force of history comes from the fact that we do carry it within us and unconsciously controlled by it in many ways. And history is literally present in all we do. He then talks about how terrifying it's sometimes to face different aspects of history, especially history that's not been told, because through that is the way that we can also begin to liberate and change history. In addition to this quote, I want to remind all of us, and this is what I'm going to carry through this presentation, and especially in relation to depth psychology and how it's held and perceived in traditional disciplines in our world, and in the discipline of psychology itself, is who gets to tell history, who has the power to tell history, whose history is told, whose history is excluded. And those of you familiar with work of, say, Simone de Beauvoir and The Second Sex, her argument that one of the reasons women are so in such positions often of continued oppression is because they are denied historical accounts or the more recent works by Howard Zinn, People's History of the United States. If you're not familiar with that, it is of telling the history from a standpoint of people who do not have power, or who did not have power in the same way as those in power who got to tell their history and historical account. So with that, I want to show you some historical things. I teach history of psychology and clinical and present a lot on history of psychology. And so one of the places I want to start is back with Hellenistic Greeks. These are Greeks before ancient Greeks that used mythic imagination to recognize what is human, and we often turn to their mythic sensibilities. These are Hellenistic Greeks, starting with Socrates and then Aristotle, Plato, and a lot of their disciples, who really turn to ideas about the importance of rationality, and rationality that is takes precedent over emotions, over relationships, over other human aspects of being function and human. So one of the stories that is most often excluded, for example, is the story of Socrates, one of his wives, which had several, Xanthippe, his main wife, whom he, according to his disciples' historical accounts, married to prove that he, a great rational man, to break like a horse, he says, because women are too emotional. Women have defective brains from defective sperms. And here's the picture of her pouring urine on great man Socrates. What she's most remembered for is that she showed up at Socrates' last kind of suicide event, and begged him with her children to not kill himself, because he would also condemn her and their children to death. So therefore, in oeuvre of these scholars, Xanthippe, until 1960s, was used, this is from an encyclopedia, as an example of a shrew. So definition of a shrew, Xanthippe, nagging peevish wife. Robert Graves, great writer and poet, has a remarkable essay in 1960s called In Case of Xanthippe. And he discusses how this kind of history and this kind of different way of holding what is human has resulted in Western attention being so squarely focused on rationality and control, and away from imagination, creativity, poetry, and so forth. So moving on, what I especially write about is this history of witch hunts. They certainly were centered in Europe. They did travel with conquistadors and across the globe. But during the times of Renaissance and the Enlightenment, the great untold history is that there are estimates 9 million, 11 million, mostly women, 85% of witches that were tortured publicly, tried publicly, and killed publicly were women. So as Renaissance is going on, the universities are being formed. They're open to primarily men of wealth in Europe. The professions are being formed, such as medicine. They are open once again to only particular group of people. Meanwhile, the midwives, considered the evilest of witches, but also women of knowledge, women of influence, women for their sexuality, women for their emotions. So that's what I write about it. That one of the most common description of a witch was an angry woman. And so women were killed by millions, often, every town in every square, except for Lord's Day Sunday, it was told that the public murders of witches took place for hundreds of years. And so that is another history for us to hold and wonder. And as we move into depth psychology and psychoanalysis, who are the hysterical women and what are the fears and hysterias abound? Witch hunts are also by scholars considered the kind of birthing place of formalized European xenophobic and racist practices. The Jews and foreigners were accused of being possessed by demons and influencing others. And so were also Roma people, so were the poets, so were the so-called feminine men, so and so forth. So these are the great times of untold histories when sciences, including kind of what modern psychology sciences take place, and there's a whole lot of other extermination of who is bad is going on. I believe that that continues in what kind of evolutionary theories have persisted and how they developed as witch hunts desist in Europe and stop more or less around mid-19th century. Charles Darwin travels to Galapagos Island, and some scholars highlight that he finds a confirmation of his social views in lives of animal and plants, and then he does actively extend these ideas to ideas in regards to human social differences, especially between quote, quote, civilized and uncivilized races, and between women and men. There are other evolutionary theories. There's always the other scientific ideas, people who resist these kind of applications of sciences. And for example, in about half a century before Darwin, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck wrote Philosophical Zoology, in which he emphasized that evolution moves through social context, the influence of the environment. That is one of the key things to evolution. So Lamarckian evolutionary theorists, in fact, are much more central to depth psychologies and a lot of philosophies moving forward. There's another evolutionary theorist that has been rediscovered, and he was about half a century after Darwin's Galapagos adventures. And his name was Pyotr Kropotkin. He was a Russian biologist, and he decided to go to the tundra, deepest tundra in Siberia, and study what he believed he would find is the survival of the fittest and fight for procreation and resources, and the kind of, natural selection where the fittest kill unfit. And what he finds is that evolution, in his view, moves through what he called mutual aid, through interdependence, interrelationships. It's connections within and between species. And so his book is called The Mutual Aid. If you're interested, it's translated in a few dozen years ago into English. Nevertheless, the power and academic power resides in the works of Charles Darwin and what became social Darwinism, of applying these theories to human social differences. And if you read especially his book, Darwin's Descent of Man, in relation to sex, it is a powerful kind of collection of thoughts about how certain groups are superior to others and why, and so forth. Social Darwinism, of course, gives birth to eugenics. So familiar with eugenics would connect it to Nazi purity campaign and Holocaust, also apartheid, also Jim Crow laws, and so forth. But Galton, who is, of course, a colleague and cousin of Darwin, develops formal science of what he calls eugenics. And eugenics is called science of, he calls it a proven stock. It's science of human betterment or science of racial betterment. And with this science, Galton, together with Darwin and a lot of other scholars, proposed to scientifically speed up evolution and get rid of the unwanted groups through what they called negative eugenics, which would be let them die out, let them kill themselves off, we kill them off, that's the kind of getting rid of them, and especially don't let the unfit procreate in different ways. And positive eugenics is select positive, what they believed characteristics of people who is fit, and teach him how to be appropriately fit, which is emotionally controlled, sexually controlled. These are better strains of blood. How did Galton decide on who's who and what's what? His book in the 1860s comes out. It's called Hereditary Genius. He studies Cambridge University graduates and who he called great men of history versus London poor versus minorities around the world. He says he travels the world. He, for example, says that indigenous people are morose and melancholy and lack intellectual capacities in such a degree that they could not learn morality from Spaniards, according to Galton. He says African Black people are lack impulse, lack intelligence, and he compared them to African oxen who must be beaten to be told what to do. And so this is how Galton writes. He says, you know, who goes to Cambridge? If these people, the poor and the others are not in kind of top of the evolutionary fitness, they are unfit. And they began create both psychology and measurements in psychology that differentiate the fit from the unfit, who is the genius, who is not. And so the eugenics becomes really prominent in academic Western psychology. Again, the other history not told, and I really encourage you to read, for example, J.K. Chesterton's book on eugenics and other evils. It came out in 1920s. J.K. Chesterton, if you're familiar with literature, wrote wonderful series Father Brown, which is kind of detective stories, but he also wrote this remarkable book in which he called eugenics a new scientific tyranny. And and he wrote about that as well. So, you know, much of what is known as Western psychology, including statistics, was spurred by eugenic interests. Carl Pearson, you recognize him, you remember your stats. Pearson R, he's a founder of field of statistics. He is studies in London. He openly writes that eugenics is inspiration for developing statistics. Carl Pearson, like others, begins to shame individuals for being interested in humanities or being interested in having other views of human experience. For example, in his book here, 1905, very popular book, National Life for a Standpoint of Science, he dedicates it to all of all of the people who believe in science and evolution and against from this kind of humanistic impulses that get us in bad water with you know, being too soft and so forth. So for example, he shamed readers for reading Fenimore Cooper. Those of you who are readers, that is Deerslayer, Last of the Mohicans. And he says it makes people develop sympathy towards, he quote, Red Indian, versus knowing, and here's his quote, that the evolutionary theory is proved chiefly by way of war with inferior races, which means that the European white colonizers exterminated Native Americans that's a proof and a natural history view of mankind. Carl Pearson does a lot of statistical studies. He compared London wealthy against London poor, and he found that London poor hereditarily weak and are drinking and having tuberculosis and having disabilities and having all kinds of illnesses because it's in their blood. He also, for example, what could prove that Jewish, Russian, and other Southern European immigrants to Britain had what he called parasitic blood and so forth. So it's a fascinating read on foundations and statistics. Here is a study. It was first study conducted by journalists, but you can see what the push was and how the statistics was used. The study was called a study of Ada Jukes. It was a fictional name. You can think about the anti-Semitic application of these names. A name of a woman, and here was very common push to sterilize unfit people because 92% of her descendants were mentally diseased, sex perverts, illegitimates, paupers, poor, and criminals and murderers. So eugenicists promised utopias. Galton used the word utopias, and if you see the word utopia subsequently, look for eugenics, look for some smell of it. Popenoe and Johnson. Popenoe ran Human Betterment Foundation here in Pasadena, California, which, by the way, through late 1930s had Nazi eugenic exhibits, sterilized more people in state of California, especially women and girls of color, for being oversexed than almost anywhere else in the world for a time. And they promised happiness for all, harmony and totality of happiness for all sentient beings and men, if you followed eugenic sciences. Here's Nearing, who's a scientist in the US. He promised to build America as a super race by breeding the Superman. You just have to behave optimally. That's positive eugenics and so forth. So look up for these scientific promises. There are, of course, alternative movements. There are people who are working tirelessly to help the poor, people who are offering help. And will come, one of them, in my view, is depth psychology. But one of the things of positive psychology, so you know, brain training exercises, including just take deep breath, only think positive thoughts, only read good books, be happy in the time of trials and tribulations. It was offered. Melendi was a scholar, medical scholar at the University of Chicago. Here's a quote from her book: "Never look on the dark side of anything. If it has no bright side, don't look at it at all. Look at something else." And she especially, the book directed at women of how to be well-behaved and happy housewife and caregiver. You could get a eugenic certificate. This is one of a real copy of eugenic strong love possibilities. Only eugenically fit could be marrying, and so to promote happiness and future welfare of the race. So you know, in terms of psychology, and we come to depth psychological treatment, the belief was that offering treatment to eugenically unfit, whether physically unfit people with disabilities, sexual disorders, especially syphilis, or people who were melancholy or daydreamers, was to promote bad blood, bad kind of characteristics. So here's some quotes from Applied Eugenics, the most popular academic and pop psychology book for many, many years until 1940s in US. So that, for example, many who commit suicide are mentally diseased. And if they could make way with themselves 20, 30 years earlier, it would be a eugenic gain. So for also, how does syphilis, why don't we treat TB, syphilis, and others? Because these people lack in self-control, and if you get rid of them. So I think the Tuskegee study was a classic eugenic study. And here we come to depth psychology. This is Freud's couch that was moved to London. Looks, you know, always Turkish carpets. They're quite worn carpets. And he saw people right off the streets coming off London and laying down. So to remind you that Freud, he was referred to as a godless Jew, created a psychology in these times that began to look at humanity vastly different. So those of you familiar a little bit with foundations of depth psychology, he begins to see, especially women, with incredible signs of what they called hysteria. They were paralyzed, they had sexual thoughts and feelings that were absolutely inappropriate. They lacked emotional control, and they were, you know, just real considered problems. And Freud begins a method that he calls the talking cure. He listens. He begins to write about war trauma. Mourning and Melancholy is a remarkable book about war trauma. He questions ideas that sexuality is only about procreation. He wonders about scapegoating on certain communities. Relationships, especially early relationship, become central to theories. There's always importance of social control and external factors. Read his cases. It's remarkable to see that he's talking and treating people who have tuberculosis and syphilis. They have sexual desires and behaviors totally outside the norms. People who experience sexual violence, they are melancholy, they're traumatized. And this is the foundations of depth psychology, to my mind, that stand in remarkable contrast to what was dominant norms considered scientific. To remind you also of Freud's daughter, Sophie, died in the Spanish influenza. So she died of, like people are dying today, of pneumonia. She wasting till she couldn't breathe. And so he witnessed that. To remind you that Freud barely escaped to London with Nazi emergence, and 4 of his sisters died in concentration camps. These are people who are facing plagues and violence of unprecedented proportions. So 1911 Psychoanalytic Congress, also to remind you, eugenicists did not believe in education of girls very much beyond certain point, because their brains would take up the needed energy and blood from their wombs to become, breeders for future good races. And here's Psychoanalytic Congress, lots of women who became medical doctors and then psychoanalysts, a lot of course, as you know, Jewish analysts, all others who were considered parasitic, Russians, Hungarians, and so forth and so on. So here's some quotes from Freud. People often, there's in Freud bashing. That's another thing in our discipline. Professional sport, I call it, in psychology, bash Freud. So he wrote, social justice means that we do deny ourselves many things because others do without them. And then that we demand for equality. It's a root of social conscience in the sense of duty. He writes about these are, these things. The night vision, I encourage you to read in a book by a notable faculty, Dr. Mary Watkins and Helene Schulman in the Community Liberation Indigenous Eco-Psychology program. They have a whole chapter on night vision and psychoanalysis. The early psychoanalysts who began free clinic movement, who discussed the impact of poverty, free kindergarten movement, worked with veterans, and so forth. There are other books I recommend as by Elizabeth Danto and Aaron, Lou Aaron, and, it's Aaron should be, and Karen Starr. And of course there's Jung. And Jung takes things away from biology and medical, and he begins to ask about imagination and the role of myth and story and self and dreams, and really listen to such different ways of holding psychological imagination. You know that depth psychology did make it to these shores. In the middle, it's Stanley Hall, who invited, there's of course Jung and Freud and Ferenczi and Adler, and they came to give talks. They described their talks as incredibly hostile, which they were. None of these individuals, I believe, definitely Freud and Jung, refused any other subsequent academic invitations. Freud stated that he felt that he brought plague to America with psychoanalysis. Jung only came twice more, only on invitation of tribal leaders. He came with an invitation to and stayed with a Native American tribe in New York State, and another one in New Mexico in Pueblo Indian Reservation. And so here we come to eugenics and American psychology. Stanley Hall, who was the key leader, he was first president of American Psychological Association. In the main journal of applied psychology, this is its first issue in 1917. He's its editor. And he says, there's about wars in Europe, and it's a terrible thing because the great Nordic race is committing suicides. And American psychology needs to take over the eugenic psychologies, but especially in the second paragraph, he warns against revisionary conceptions of Freud, that it's normal in time to plunge back and down the evolutionary ladder. So, Stanley Hall was incredibly committed to eugenics, social Darwinism. He promoted what he called religious moral psychology. He wrote about rapacious Jews that destroy Western cultures. He wrote about white man's burden, relation to lower races. He was very much against educating girls because if you overeducate girls, he believed it would be race suicide because girls would forgo supreme joys of motherhood. He attacked Freud in many of his writing, calling it a cult and calling it immoral. He trained many eugenic psychologists, and he's listed in almost every eugenic organization I found. He trained lots of other famous psychologists, which all have still long-standing influences. One of them is Robert Rojcewicz, who is still, there's a Rojcewicz primate lab. So comparative animal psychology begins, where you begin to learn about human social difference through caged and tortured and experimented animals. So he also, will come to them, ran army mental tests. He published openly eugenic articles about the key role psychology could play in eugenics, the art of breeding better men. And he, for example, edited Journal of Comparative Psychology. Here's some examples of studies. They were obsessed with the amount of white blood. So here's the more white blood you have in the American Indian, then said the higher intelligent. Margaret Washburn, who was second female president of American Psychological Association, a student of Hall, found what she called striking national difference, that Jewish women, in contrast to French and German women, lacked empathy towards others. They proved that women were emotional than men. They found a difference between going from light to darkness skin color in Black children. One of the other students by Stanley Hall, very famous psychologist, H.H. Goddard, he's listed in more popular and non-popular and legal press than any other psychologist until almost 1960s. He runs the Kallikak study. Like the Juke study, he proves that badness is hereditary. So, this is Deborah Kallikak. She's an orphan. She is in multiple orphanages before she ends up in asylum ran by Goddard called Violent. He tests her by modern scholars. She had learning disabilities. She cannot learn to read and write. She's brilliant in many other ways. But he believes that she is one of those borderline parasitic, unfit people whom he calls, he gives terminology, and he says that psychology is especially important because people like that appear normal, but in fact are very, very dangerous to society. And so he tests immigrants at Ellis Island. He finds that over 80% of Jews, Russians, Hungarians, Greeks are feeble-minded. That's his category of feeble-mindedness. The study is enormously important. So, it was translated to German multiple times. Nazi scholars praised it for being foundational to their, quote, purity laws. In the legal case of Buck versus Bell, that's the first of involuntary sterilization. It was used as scientific evidence towards sterilizing Carrie Buck. Carrie Buck was a young woman adopted and raped in her family and then accused of being feeble-minded. Louis Terman is a eugenicist and the founder of assessments. He praises the study. Hunter, who is the main biology scholar in the US, begins to include it in his biology books, that Kallikak's true parasites. Fisher, who is at Yale University, both, I think, one-time president and very involved in social hygiene movement, says the Kallikak study is essential to determining who is and getting rid of feeble-minded, alcoholic, criminalistic, epileptic, insane, migranic, neurotic, paralytic, and so forth. Army mental tests is the beginning of American psychology because it needed to differentiate itself from philosophy and get power and money, and who is who in American psychology participates in these Army mental tests of close to 2 million people funded by the government. Carl Brigham, who is at Princeton, who is also, if you know your history, is developer of SAT, Scholastic Apperception Tests, summarizes the study in a book published for everybody to read. It's called A Study in American Intelligence. It proves that almost all Black people have lowest level of intelligence. It says that it proved that Jew is not intelligent, and it proved that average intelligence of Americans is declining because of immigration. And it is used to create all kinds of Jim Crow laws and very restrictive immigration policies. Eugenics continue. Those of you familiar with Janssen and Jansenism, measuring of intelligence in particular way, IQ intervals, or the black bell shape by Herrnstein and Murray, which is all over the place, full of eugenic measurements of intelligence that now uses the term not unfit or feeble-minded, but cognitive elites versus cognitive underclasses. John B. Watson, read John B. Watson because he is a leader in eugenic organization. He creates behaviorism, which he proves that psychology can control and predict. All of his studies are filled with positive eugenics. He also begins a series of rather abusive experiments on infants and children. One of them is known to us in myths and psychology is Little Albert. He, of course, does a lot of experiments on rats, sometimes boasting that he could kill 600 rats for a single experiment. His Little Albert experience is in fact passed on to us as a lie because it was never really, Little Albert was never really conditioned or really unconditioned in his fear. I think what is more stunning is what was done to Little Albert, who was 6 to 9 months old, as you saw in the picture before. For example, John B. Watson writes in all of his behaviorist books that he experimented on erogenous zones. So here for Little Albert, he planned to combine fear responses with stimulation of erogenous zones, which would be lips, nipples, and sex organs of a little infant. So eugenics persisted. I just want to kind of remind you that where dominant psychology is, one of the most racist organizations in the United States called the Pioneer Fund funded only scientists, most of them psychology, read up on them on Southern Poverty Law Center. Garrett, who was IPA president one time, was the one who fought against desegregation. He began to use the term that equality is a dogma. It's an unscientific dogma. In contrast, there's Carl Jung, who is continually writing about questioning mainstream psychology, questioning this kind of move towards control and positivity. There's cultural psychoanalysis in the US. You know, there's some of my favorite, Karen Horney, Eric Fromm, Aristotle Sullivan, Clara Thomas. And here's some of the work they do. Karen Horney, of course, is considered foundational to feminist psychology, where it says culture is more important to psychology than some biology. Eric Fromm writes about to have and to be. Aristotle Sullivan studies impact of homophobia and so forth. Among most important, in my view, of depth psychologists is Frantz Fanon. And Frantz Fanon is a trained psychoanalyst who works psychoanalytically. He's trained in Europe, but works psychoanalytically in Northern Africa and begins to join and inspire anti-colonial Black consciousness and other liberation movements around the world. His book, Black Skin, White Masks and Wretched of the Earth are remarkable. But here's this invitation that clinical depth psychology can look at how imperialism leaves behind germs of rot and how to remove them as clinicians. So his books are just moving in terms of looking at depth psychological ways we are, or people are colonized by oppression and integrate that oppression through stereotypes and unquestioningly follow science. He questions science quite a bit in his books. But back in the US, there's Albert Ellis and others who promise to cure, that relationship don't matter, that therapeutic conditions don't matter. He attacks continually. He calls Freud as someone full of horseshit, he says. And he promises, for example, to cure homosexuality in his book and conversion therapy book, and versus attacking, he said, Freudian psychoanalytic methods make it worse. There are contemporary geneticists like Ising, who attacked psychoanalysis and depth psychology, and he was funded by Pioneer Fund. Right now, by the way, so you know, he's being reviewed, be published as late as 1980s studies where he proved that evolutionary fit people had superior personality, could not addicted to tobacco. There's positive psychology in torture. This is moving more closer to our times today. Seligman, who is a big proponent of positive psychology, tortured dogs in his learned helplessness study and was central to enhance interrogations. Do read the Hoffman report about APA. Instead, positive psychology, if you read the books, for example, he says, it's American demagogues who plays the race card, invoking reminders of slavery that create vengeful mindset in their followers. He says that history does not make any difference. Race does not make any difference. In fact, he says, it's heredity and character. So should sound familiar. There's evolutionary psychology, and it only means Darwinian evolutionary psychology, that today there are open publications that are very popular, like by Pinker, Steven Pinker, who says, why should we dismiss everything that Hitler did? Only anti-scientific propaganda, he says, dismisses Galton and eugenics. And he calls Freud, Lacan, Fanon, Eric Fromm, Jacques Derrida, Cornel West, prophets of doom. There are other attacks on depth psychology, and I'm going to go through them very quickly. It's, for example, David Duke's My Awakening. David Duke is KKK leader. His book is introduced by American psychologists and one-time president of Behavioral Association. It attacks depth psychology. Depth psychology is attacked as empirically it's just like, well, it doesn't have evidence behind it. I urge you to read up on what actually has evidence and what doesn't. So here's an article in American Psychologist by Jonathan Shedler about the politics in our field, and read up, including on Pacifica website, about incredible evidence behind depth psychologies. And more so, I think about, look at how liberation, critical, indigenous, and decolonial psychology often draw on depth psychological traditions. And across all the programs, there's this invitation to look into, like Howard Zenn's, what is people's psychology? What is different ways of holding what is psychological? So to end my presentation, I want to kind of come back to vital importance of learning about what it means to be human, not from rats and cages and not from statistical bell shapes, but from humanities and stories and myths. Joseph Campbell, whose work directly and literally is the foundational one of them to Pacifica, invites to consider what's a hero's journey. And think of yourself, your journey that begins with a call. Look, you're in a sleepy land, awake, come on a trip, because there's consciousness that's not being touched. Where is your home? And so it starts. To remind you that his journey begins with the status quo. We just accept life as it is. And then we begin this call to adventure. And it's full of trials and it's full of ordeals. And then there's a difficulty of the return at the end, right? And so there's, what does myth teach us? What does stories teach us? What does so much more than some of the more what I call the other psychologies teach us? What do we have to learn now? What are the trials and calls to adventure you and I and we as a community are holding? What it would be like for us, we're returning to the world as is. So I'm going to end with this letter to Anna Freud by a person named John, who wrote to her and said, I want to be a psychoanalyst. So if you want to be depth psychology scholar, if you think you want to be depth psychology clinician, I find her letter really moving, because she begins and says, if you want to be a real psychoanalyst, you have to have great love of truth. Yes, scientific truth, but also personal truth. An appreciation for truth that's higher than discomfort and meeting unpleasant facts, because it belongs both outside world, but your own inner person. And then she says that you must have interest beyond the limit of medical field, that it needs to be from sociology, religion, and literature. This letter is written, by the way, in 1940s. And so she encourages, says, you ought to be a great reader, become acquainted with literature of many countries and cultures. In the great literary figures, you will find people who know at least as much of human nature as psychiatrists, psychologists try to do. And then she answers, does that answer your question? So in this presentation, I hope I touched upon and stirred your curiosity, disturbed your views of histories and psychologies, introduced you to other ways of holding what psychologically may be there in our world and communities. I encourage you to explore our Pacifica programs, faculty publications and presentations, and just for your own self, no matter what you decide on your journey. You were called to this event. I believe you're being called to be in the world and to be in your own life. And I hope and wish you very best to answer the questions. And to end is the Frantz Fanon. It's the last statement in his Black Skin, White Masks book. It says, "Oh, our souls, make us people who question." Thank you very much. We have just a little bit of time for very few questions. I encourage you to email me, and it's oyakushka@pacifica.edu, and follow up. My colleague will cover clinical psychology PhD program today, and I hope and all of my remarkable colleagues, so faculty and other programs, will be with you this afternoon and maybe take these ideas into their specific disciplines. I appreciate you being with us, and just a couple of questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay, so here is the first question. Can you speak a little more on the bridge from this history into the present?
One of the things I want to highlight is what kind of psychology are sanctioned and what kind of psychology are dominate in some ways. What continues is this kind of split between very particular view of humanity in psychology and what is considered to be on the margins. So I think that would be one place for all of you familiar with contemporary psychology would be a place to start. Another thing is to kind of continually question what is being split off. Why is this history so pushed out? Why do we, how much of, we've been drinking this Kool-Aid ourselves, and how colonized we are in terms of our views of not just psychology, but humanity, what it means to be fully human. And so I think that, you know, I just invite you, there's, you know, I am so not alone in writing about these, in every disciplines, there are individuals about writing on history and gender history and sexuality history, and of course, history of race and culture and so forth. So I want to invite you to be readers and be curious, and also pay attention how much psychoanalytic Jungian traditions have played key role in the raising awareness and holding what is being split off and being made unconscious and denied.
Thank you. Another attendee wants to know, when was a more compassionate, less biased approach to psychology came into the picture? Would you contribute this mostly to Jung or any other scholars?
Well, I think, you know, one is probably depends on our view of compassion. The stunning thing to read about eugenicists, and I read, you can see, I read original text. I will actually read what Aristotle and Plato and the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. I read original eugenicists. They believe themselves to be compassionate. They believe that if you let the person who is sick die and die early, in fact, not let them be born was compassionate, right? So for Watson, he believed that it was really good to absolutely control child's emotional world in harsh ways. And he said it raised happy, efficient people. So I think it depends on some definitions of what means compassionate. I, in my view, think when I read Freud, I think he was remarkably compassionate person. The people he met with would have been burned as witches. Women he met with, they were absolutely, they were literally castrated and sterilized for their symptoms. And he talked to them, he listened to them. I think Jung, in his capacity to look beyond, you know, the biological and narrow views of humanity into the imaginative, spiritual, and esoteric, was a different form of compassion. And so I just, you know, I think about what that means. And I think, you know, certainly there are other existential, humanistic, and other voices that are added in psychology, all of them vital. But nevertheless, kind of my view of compassion is to accept the vital importance of diverse ways we're all human, including all of our human reactions as valid and valuable, so-called negative to anything positive, all of ways of being, all of ways of our physical somatic being, as valuable and important and something we're listening to. And so is, you know, in terms of the world and the earth and the species of, and so forth. So I feel like how to radical compassion to me is a very inclusive view.
Thank you. Another question, how can we utilize this information and transform it into action? How can we balance this mistreatment that has created such an imbalance and how we view ourselves, each other, and our world?
Such an important question. You can see how depth psychology and then across, I think a lot of our programs and disciplines, we all try to answer that question. I think to us, it's what is some of it individual call. I think one of the places is to begin is to do our own inner work. Whether we call it the work of individuation, our own work on our woundedness, and I think an important work of decolonizing our own lives. I think it could be taking place individually. That's the power of in my view, of depth clinical perspectives, is that kind of work that can be done also with individual human beings that suffer, and suffer not just because of individual traumas, but also how those individual traumas were created by some of these social conditions. But then how do we take it to communities? So those of you who are interested in clinical psychology PhD, I'm going to right away encourage you to begin to develop your voice as clinicians individually, but also write and publish, present, read history, respond to things you see in the media. I feel, for example, me and my colleague, we responded to use of witch hunts by current political figures in very inappropriate ways, and to question who were the witches in history and how witch hunts are important, including in this time, who is being demonized. And so be advocates, I guess, in the world, but I also always say it's vital that we begin with ourselves. We are wounded healers, we're wounded researchers, and part of our woundedness is we ourselves have been drinking the Kool-Aid and been colonized, and often embrace many of these ideas. And so I hope that kind of it's that Anna Freud's idea of radical, difficult truth about ourselves, just as we also are able to sit with people who are ill and dying and struggling, and right now are terrified sometimes, and people who do not have resources and who are on the margins of society, that we create capacity in ourselves to sit with all that too. And also to look for ways that it opens us to creativity, community, mutual aid from Kropotkin, collaboration and love and joy.
So let's just take one more question and then we'll end there. So another question has to do with bringing it to the present. How can we anticipate the evolution of eugenics in the current times, post-pandemic era? Do you think there will be a repetition of health-based discrimination that you discussed?
I think it's already there. I think what we're witnessing in the way who gets treatment, who doesn't, what resources people have. Listen to the language that is used about fitness, who's fit and who survives. I think there's a way that sometimes we used our notions of like, well, it's good for environment for people to die, which I think is stunning, but was used before. Eugenicists said it's good for the environment, it's good for economy, and so forth. I think it's how do we struggle with these ideas? And eugenics have been and continue, neo-eugenics are fairly, they operate in society. They are that language of civilized fitness, unfit, segregation is being used still. I think, the pieces of it to invite ourselves is to see through where it begins to enter our professions, professional world, our communities, and to really stand firm against the ideas that certain people deserve to live and certain people it's good for them to die. Because at what point, as Holocaust teaches us, as apartheid teaches us, as Jim Crow laws, and all of those eugenic-based history teaches, when do we stop? What is then, what are the limits of this? And there are a lot of people writing about kind of eugenics and new eugenics, but psychology has been very much a leader in producing eugenic ideologies, including now. And so I want to you know, we need to not, you know, I tend to be a person, I've been trying to write about that in, you know, under the guise of in science we trust, that any science is neutral and non-ideological, which is absolutely not true. We're human beings producing scientific work, and some science is ideological. So is you know, eugenics, you know, if you read up on it and recognize it. But also to say our science, you know, to make a standpoint, we do have values, we have commitments, we have our own views, and to have them be consistent with how we see humanity, how we see the world, what is conscious and unconscious, what is valuable, what is valued, and what is to be loved and to be saved and treasured. So thank you all for all of your incredible questions. These are, I think, difficult topics. Again, read and question, and do it for loving the world and being with yourselves in remarkable ways. And I hope that if you're interested, in my view, Pacifica is one of those academic spaces that makes room for these kind of questioning, this kind of imagination, invites you to create the kind of psychology that speaks to full humanity. And I hope you know, explore what Pacifica has to offer. And I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yakushko, and thank you again to everyone for joining. So